Hello and welcome to the first in what I hope will be a little series of videos that we are calling Ovid, not COVID, in which we get to focus on something interesting and I hope entertaining and perhaps even educational, heaven help us, Ovid, rather than something difficult and depressing which we can't do very much about, COVID. And so what I'm going to do is make a set of videos looking at each one of the poems in Ovid's collection, the Herodes, which are poems written by the abandoned wives of Greek myth to their absent menfolk. So the first, which we'll look at next, of course, is from Penelope to her husband Ulysses. Ulysses is the Roman name for Odysseus. And Penelope famously waits 20 years for him to come home. Before I say very much more, that'll be episode 2. Before I say very much more, I should tell you that Ovid is for certain what would now often be described as problematic as a poet. There are all kinds of things about Ovid which you may find difficult. His poem, The Metamorphoses, for example, a big epic poem across 15 books, I think, is full of scenes of extreme sexual violence, which a lot of people find very upsetting, and that is fair enough. I'm not going to try and sell you Ovid. If you don't feel comfortable reading him, that's fair enough. I respect your position. I'm sad for you because he's a beautiful poet, but I understand that that's not going to be enough for everyone. If you want to hear more about Ovid in general, please feel free to download from BBC Sounds the Ovid episode of my Radio 4 show, Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics. I think Ovid was series 3, but I would be lying if I said I could remember. It could be series 2. I love the Herodes because they are an extraordinary collection of poems. They are this so difficult man who is obsessed with sex, and particularly with him getting sex from people who are frankly consenting or not consenting alike, at least according to the character that he portrays in his love poetry. This set of poems shows that this extraordinary poet can imagine what it's like to be a woman, and not just a woman, but a woman abandoned, a woman in love, and left behind in the case of, let's say, Ariadne, or waiting for her husband to come home for 20 years in the case of Penelope, or realising that her husband has betrayed her in the case of Medea. Some of these women take terrible actions, some of them are quite passive, some of them are filled with love, some of them are filled with hate and revenge, sometimes all of the above. But it's just the most incredible act of literary transvestism. This is a poet who can imagine a whole experience that we would expect men of his time to not be able to consider. I mean, generally, if you're looking for poets who write women really well in the ancient world, it's Euripides, Ovid, and Book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. I mean, there are a few others, but generally male poets didn't imagine women particularly successfully. Ovid is a remarkable exception to that rule. So I'll be back in a couple of days with Penelope and Ulysses, but in the meantime, keep safe and I'll talk to you soon. Hello and welcome to the 5th of Ovid's Herodes. This letter is from Oenone, who is a water nymph who lives in a forest outside Troy, and she is the first wife of Paris, who leaves her in order to go and claim Helen of Sparta at the time, who will go on to become Helen of Troy. I always think it's worth bearing in mind that when Paris and Helen elope, they leave behind 2 people, not just one. We always think of Menelaus, the husband of Helen, who gathers a huge army alongside his brother Agamemnon, and they all sail to Troy to bring her back. Oenone responds to the loss of her husband by bringing up their child single-handedly. Sometimes I think we forget what a hero might actually be. Anyway, this is the poem from Oenone to Paris, and she is not as sympathetic as I have just made her sound, I promise you. Will you read this? She says at the start, or doesn't your new wife let you? You should read it. It's not like it's coming from a Mycenaean hand. What she means there is it's not like Menelaus or one of his friends is writing to Paris with a sort of threat. It's just from a nymph, don't worry. Nope, she says, it's from the fountain nymph Oenone. I am very famous in the Phrygian woods. I absolutely love this as a suggestion. To be celebrated within a wood is something we should all aspire to. It's even better than being big in Japan. What crime have I committed which means you won't stay with me? she asks. And then she starts to get a little bit status aware. She says, you weren't anyone when you were happily married to me, whereas I was the daughter of a great big river. So who is the impressive one here? She says, sure, now you're the son of Priam. Paris is sort of abandoned as a child because, in various versions of the myth, because he's destined to cause the downfall of Troy. And so he grows up as a sort of shepherd around Mount Ida in this very rural idyll. That's where he meets Oenone. But when he goes to Troy to sort of reclaim his patrimony and say, look, I am the son you lost, he therefore he goes up in the world, I suppose we might say, moves from a sort of rural idyll life to a life of luxury in the city. And this is something that bothers Oenone a lot, it is fair to say. She says, yeah, now you're a son of Priam, but you were a slave. And I was quite happy to marry a slave, even though I was a nymph and daughter of a great big river. I can't tell you how much that makes me happy. She talks about that kind of idyllic life. She says, we made our bed on leaves and grass. We had a little hut that protected us when it was frosty. I love this. You carved my name. You carved Oenone into a poplar tree. Yes, Paris, not just a wife stealer, also a vandal. That's all I'm saying. And as the tree grew, she says, so my name grew with it. And she says, and then you wrote, if Paris leaves Oenone and still breathes, let the waters of the river Xanthus flow back towards its source. Well, river Xanthus, Paris did, she says, spurn Oenone, so you should be flowing backwards right now because he is definitely still breathing. I kind of like her at this point. She gets worse, I'm afraid. Now she says, it's amoris hiems, it's the winter of my love. What an incredible two-word phrase. Ovid is so good at these. She says it all went wrong when Paris judged the beauty competition between Juno, Minerva and Venus. That's Hera, Athene and Aphrodite. The judgment of Paris, as it's known, when the golden apple has to be awarded to one. He gets it right, and as far as Venus is concerned, very wrong as far as the other two are concerned. And his reward for choosing Venus is Helen. Which obviously causes a 10-year war and the destruction of a city. So, reward. She says, when you left me, you wept. Flesti discerdens, hoc saltem parce negare. You left me crying. Don't pretend that you didn't now. Don't try and deny it now. We both wept. She says, our tears mingled. You clung to me like a vine clings to an elm. You kept pretending that the wind wasn't favourable so you could come back and embrace me again. The other sailors were laughing at you because it was all fine and they were ready to go. I prayed for your swift return, she says. How was I to know my prayers were helping someone else and not me? And she knows that things have gone wrong when she sees the ship come back. I saw something flash purple, she said. Purple is an incredibly expensive fabric in the ancient world. It's made from the shells of the murex, the sort of sea snails. It's incredibly expensive to make. It's what Roman emperors' purple togas were made of many, many centuries later. She says, I saw something flash purple and I was worried because you were never that fancy before. Then, of course, she sees that Paris is with Helen. She tears her clothes. She rips her cheeks open. And then she turns vengeful. She says, I hope Helen is abandoned. I hope she grieves like this. She hurt me first. She deserves it. Let her feel it. The essence of Oenone's problem, though, is not just Helen. It's that Paris has changed. Now he wants this sort of fancy city life. He doesn't want a simple rural life, which is what she was part of. And she's hurt on multiple levels, therefore. She says, I would have been an excellent daughter-in-law to Priam and to Hecuba. They didn't need to be ashamed of me if that's the life that you wanted. She is, let's remind ourselves, the daughter of a great big river. She's very respectable in river terms. My love was safe, she says. It didn't provoke any wars. It didn't draw avenging ships across the waves. I wonder a little bit if that's what hurts the most, that she was such a safe bet for Paris, and of course in the end he chose danger. He chose the war rather than the woman who loved him. The army that moves against you has just cause, she says. Paris is in the wrong. He did steal another man's wife. Does she burn with love for you, she asks. Because she did the same for Menelaus. That's the trouble with being a second husband, huh? You know that someone's loved before. She says, Cassandra, your sister, Cassandra saw this coming. She said, sink the filthy Greek ship while you still can. I love Cassandra. There's nothing to say beyond that. I love her. Oenone's jealousy really gets the better of her towards the end of this poem. She blames Helen for the fact that Helen was abducted as a child by Theseus and raped by him. She says, if you go around getting abducted all the time, you must be doing something to provoke it. It is obviously a particularly horrible moment. But a few lines later, line 149, we realise why she might be so angry. She references her own rape at the hands of a man named Tros, the founder of Troy, the legendary founder of Troy. He gives Oenone healing powers as compensation for the loss of her virginity, which she didn't want but ends up with. But she says there isn't any medicine for love. I was yours, she concludes, when we were young. I pray to be yours always. I'm afraid she's too late. Paris is one of those rare people who gets multiple letters in the Herodes. He'll get a letter from Helen later on, and that connects him in an extremely unfavourable group with the recipient of the next letter, Jason. Jason will be receiving letters from both Hypsipyle, letter 6, and later Medea. So well done him. You have to be a particular cad to get more than one letter in this collection. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Hello and welcome to the fourth of the Herodes, Ovid's poems from women who have been abandoned by or are trying to make contact with their menfolk. This letter comes from Phaedra, who is the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae of Crete. She is the sister, therefore, of Asterion. We know him better as the Minotaur, and also the sister of Ariadne, who famously helps Theseus to kill the Minotaur and escape from the Labyrinth. It is therefore slightly complicated that he abandons Ariadne, and Phaedra is now married to the same man, to Theseus. It's quite a complicated family history, even before we begin the story, which is that Hippolytus is the object of Phaedra's affection. That's not her husband is Theseus. Hippolytus is her husband's son. By a previous relationship. Hippolyta, the Amazon, is Hippolytus's mother. And so Phaedra has conceived an extremely inappropriate passion for her stepson. I guess we could call it incestuous. They aren't related by blood, but certainly it's socially incestuous, we might say. So her letter begins saying that she is wishing him the health that she lacks unless he's prepared to give it to her. A Cretan girl writing to this Amazonian man. He's an Amazonian man, which seems like a contradiction in terms. Amazons are always women, because of course his mother is an Amazon. She, interestingly, refers to herself as puella, a girl, rather than femina, a woman. And so what she wants here is to elide the age gap between them. Now, we don't actually know how big an age gap that would be. Lots of commentators in the past have said, look at this delusional middle-aged woman. But she's the younger sister of Ariadne, and Ariadne was one of Theseus's earlier conquests. And then also he has his relationship with Hippolyta and a bunch of others besides, by the way. I refer you to Plutarch, who is quite snarky about Theseus's many and dubious encounters with women. And so she could easily be quite similar in age to Hippolytus. She is obviously the mother of children, but that could still only put her in her early to mid-20s. So she may still feel a bit like a puella, but perhaps there's a little bit of optimism in play here, let's say, tactfully. Whatever I put, she says, could you read it? Could you read it through? What harm could a letter do? She says to him. Now, this is a really interesting point because people reading this poem in ancient Rome would probably know the story of Euripides' play Hippolytus, which is reworked by, for example, Racine for us later audiences as Phaedra. But for Euripides, the focus is on Hippolytus, the stepson in this story. And in that, Hippolytus is killed by a letter. Phaedra hangs herself because she's rejected by Hippolytus in a really brutal way. She hangs herself, but she does something absolutely unforgivable. She leaves behind a letter in which she says that he has raped her, and it is not true. And he's cursed by his father, by Theseus, and a bull rises from the sea and obliterates him. And so when she says at the very start of this Ovid poem, what harm could a letter do? Ovid's audience is going, well, quite a lot, actually. Quite a bit of harm, since you mention it. But she's being very pretend naive, let's say, a little disingenuous. The letter is a masterclass in rhetorical persuasion. Phaedra is trying really hard to persuade this man who isn't interested in her into bed. That is always a recipe for success. No, of course, I'm joking. Lines 11 and 12, she says, whatever love orders, we can't ignore it. She says, love even rules over the gods. This is the exact argument that the nurse makes in Euripides' play to Phaedra. And Phaedra says, you know, I'm dying because of a wound of love. Then the nurse says, well, you know, just succumb. Even the gods are ruled by love. Very, very persuasive, very dubious argument. And she is maybe a little bit older than Hippolytus, because she then goes on to say that love which comes later is more serious. She says, I'm burning inside, urimor intus, she says. And then she repeats it. The next line begins with the same word, urimor, I'm burning. She says, I am nursing a hidden wound in my breast. This hurts, this love. This isn't a fun passion. It's miserable. And she keeps trying to make them an item, even without dealing with the issue of sex, which she also mentions, I might add. But she keeps trying to bind them together in different ways. Et pariter nostrum fiat uteque nocens, she says, line 28. Let's both be equally guilty. Well, that escalated fast, as I believe the young people say. There's a magnificently Ovidian flourish next at line 35. She says, oh, if Juno let me have her husband and brother, I'd still prefer Hippolytus to Jupiter. Isn't that magnificent? It's like, I would prefer you to the king of the gods. How flattering. Also, did I mention that the king and queen of the gods are siblings? Incest is fine. It's the subtext that she's gone with there. Well done, Phaedra. Nicely done. She wishes then that she could go hunting. Again, this might seem weird to us, but it's a reference to the Euripides play. Hippolytus spends all his time hunting, and his Phaedra comes on stage with sort of terrible fever. She's hallucinating almost, and she wishes she could be out hunting, as though this were sort of innocent girlhood that she's lost. Does she want to be out hunting herself with Hippolytus, or does she want to be Hippolytus a little bit? Perhaps she's tired of the restrictive palace life. We're not sure. She talks about her family history. Sexual deviancy and sexual violence is very much part of it. So Jupiter impregnates Europa. This is how their family begins. Jupiter takes on the form of a bull. Pasiphae, Phaedra's mother, of course, famously has sex with a bull while wearing a sort of what I can only describe as a wooden cow costume. I wish I could make it sound better than that. I can't. She wears a wooden cow costume. It's made by Daedalus, who also makes the Labyrinth, which will contain the offspring of that wooden cow costume bull mating, namely the Minotaur. She describes her sister being sort of taken by the traitor, the son of Aegeus. Now, when she says that, that's quite a common way of describing somebody in this kind of poetry, the son of X, the daughter of Y. But it's kind of strange, because when she says the son of Aegeus, she means Theseus, her actual husband. She is deliberately not mentioning him in the hopes that she and Hippolytus can sort of forget that he exists here, I think. It's like he's another person entirely. She says, your beauty captured me just like your father captured my sister. Just to remind everybody that Theseus has done her family a great wrong. She praises him for being beautiful. She says, if you never relax your bow, it'll go soft. That is obviously a double entendre. She says Theseus is off with his friend Pirithous anyway, so he prefers him to me and to you. Again, she's lumping them both in together. Theseus doesn't care about either of them, otherwise he'd be here. She reminds him that Theseus killed her brother in really brutal language. She says, he smashed my brother's bones with his club and scattered them on the ground. You know, we might think of the Minotaur as a monster, but for Phaedra, he was her brother. Oh, and if you're wondering where your mother is, she says, see how she's binding them together again? If you're wondering where your mother, the Amazon, is, well, he ran her through with his sword. Just to remind us that Theseus has an incredibly violent history against both of these people, Phaedra and Hippolytus. And then she goes for a more sort of sneaky rhetorical device. Jupiter made the rule, she said, that whatever pleases us is what's right. That's the morally right thing to do. Well, did he now? And then she turns to appearances. She says, you already have to kiss me in public. You've done it before. You can keep doing it. It'll be fine. What an excellent idea. What could possibly go wrong? I'm not too proud to beg, she says. I'll go down on my knees if I have to. You can insert your own subtext there. Obviously, that's fine. She says it's too late for modesty. I think we can all agree that's true. She reminds him that she is Cretan royalty. She comes with a very large dowry, so it'd be a good match for him, if only she weren't married to his dad. I know you hate girls, she says, right at the end, but why don't you quench your thirst with a wave? That would also be a double entendre, is all I have to say to you. it's an extraordinary poem, one which makes this woman who wants something so deviant seem so ostensibly reasonable, and all the while using arguments which are really plausible and essentially wrong. It's just an incredible piece of writing. Join me again next time, please, for number 5, which is Oenone to Paris. Remember how when Paris and Helen elope, they leave behind her husband Menelaus? Did you know they also left behind his wife? Well, she knows. See you next time. Bye.